We should let you know that you're being webcast through the Wilson Center web. So this event is going out to our many, many, many followers internationally. Hello, Canada. Also, if you go out to the rotunda, to the courtyard, they're apparently filming Real Housewives of the Potomac. So if you want to, make your break to fame, make sure you are well seen out there, and if not, scuttle around through the underground passageways. It is great to have you here. This is a really good-looking group and a lot of people for such an important issue. My name is Laura Dawson. I'm the director of the Canada Institute. The Canada Institute is part of the Wilson Center. We are like the Tim Hortons in a very large U.S. shopping center. The Wilson Center is a memorial to Woodrow Wilson. We are established by Congress, and we are supported by a small congressional endowment. But the work of the Canada Institute is primarily supported by private sector contributions. And we are delighted to have some of our contributors here. And if you're not a contributor, why aren't you? You should be. So before I go any further, you got to start with this stuff. Thank you to our program sponsors, Cargill and Maple Leaf. Really, without their support, we would not be able to do important programming like this. Why is it important? Because we need to have more positive voices on Canada-U.S. issues, particularly Canada-U.S. trade issues, here in Washington and elsewhere throughout North America. I have spent much of the past 2 weeks on the road doing speaking engagements, and the fundamental theme for this is NAFTA, how bad is it? And this is such a relief. This is the flip side. This is North American cooperation, Canada-U.S. cooperation. How good can it be? So thank you for bringing this dialogue and this conversation together. It is a bright spot in an otherwise pretty murky time of North American economic relations. My friend from the Farm Bureau is here. No, I've seen him every week for the past 4 or 5 weeks. Thank you to agriculture. Agriculture has been one of the strongest proponents for North American trade. Of all of the sectors, agriculture across borders has been providing a strong voice, strong leadership, and if there is a pathway ahead, it is somebody from the agriculture sector who's waving the flag. So thank you for that. About 20 years ago, maybe 17 years ago, I met the smartest man. We went for a coffee. We were talking about WTO. Was there even a WTO then? It was WTO. It was a fresh WTO. It was about 1998, 99. And we were talking about the WTO agreement on agriculture. I was working in Canada on a development project in, I think it was Russia. And I went to see the smartest law professor at the University of Ottawa, who was a specialist in agriculture trade. And I left that meeting thinking, wow, that guy is really smart. I hope we can work together. The project kind of fell through, and we reconnected after 17 or 18 years. He looks exactly the same, though. He hasn't changed. This is my partner in this project and my new old friend, Don Buckingham, who's I want to get this right. Are you the director? Are you the president? The president of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. And it was really Don's leadership and Don's suggestion that brought this whole project together. So you've heard enough from me, I think. Have I covered all the requisite talking points? Yes, I have. I'm going to turn it over to Don to do the second part of the introduction. Don Buckingham.
Well, thank you, Laura. It's a real pleasure to be here. And first of all, I want to extend thanks to you for coming, because it's one thing to think you have an important idea. It's another thing to convince 50 or 60 people who have very, very busy schedules to come and listen and learn and dialogue so that we can move this very important topic along. So this kind of an event doesn't come together without a lot of planning and a lot of goodwill, and much of that has come from Laura and Ben, and certainly from our sponsors. And the other collaborator that we are working with is the Lawrence Center at the Ivey Business School in London, Ontario.
That's the point I missed.
There you go. It's okay. So we've got them all up there, And we're just very, very much in debt to these folks to make the event like today come off. So I bring you greetings from Canada. Laura's already done a great job. But one of the great things about Canada is, you know, we always think we're very international and outward looking, but it's not really until we leave home that we realize, oh my goodness, there's a big world out there. And so just having a chance to come and be part of this dialogue in Washington makes it all real for us. So one of the great joys is reconnecting with old friends, working on projects that, quite honestly, I think we talked about some of these same issues 17 years ago, and we're talking about closer collaboration, what we can do with respect to agricultural trade and some of the challenges we might have. So I think we're here today, as Laura has said, working on what is the art of the possible in perhaps turbulent times, and you can pick your word, but it is, what is the art of the possible? And being a part of a collaborative effort is the first step. And so here we have sponsors who are from the private sector, we have think tanks from both sides of the border, and we have government regulators and negotiators in the room. So 3 legs to the stool that is advancing a very important project. There's been a lot of coverage in the news about the big picture and the big issues, and a lot of that is uncertain to negative. And I think there are some issues that are below the radar, and we're here to capitalize on some of those issues. Certainly, you know, little known probably speech by our Minister of Foreign Affairs. She said that one of the things she wanted to work on was basically looking at cutting red tape and harmonizing regulations. She didn't specifically mention agriculture, but that's why we're here today. And so while the issue of a deeper regulatory alignment is what we're looking at in agriculture, and it may not be quite as topical or high profile as a Chapter 19 disputes, keep them or leave them, rules of origin for autos, or heaven forbid, supply management, it is still an area which will make a huge difference in integration and cooperation for our agri-food sector, which is becoming more and more integrated. So today, we'd like to take you on a rollicking tour of past, present, and future. And so we're going to have 3 panels, and three sessions, I think is the best way to put it. And our first session is going to be by Bob Carberry, and he has a lot of experience, and he's going to talk to us a bit about where we've come from. And then we're going to move into a second panel and presentation about what is the art of the possible, a very specific possibility, the idea of regulatory alignment in one specific area that will affect agriculture, could have very significant implications for improving food trade integration in our 2 countries. And then finally, we're going to have a bit of an open session on, so where is NAFTA 2.0 going, and what does it mean after what we've heard today with respect to agriculture and ag-food trade. So fasten your seatbelts, and let's start the process. Do you have any other remarks?
No, that was terrific. Excellent introduction. We should get together more often than every 17 or 18 years. All right, so let's invite now Bob Carberry to the front. And you're welcome to stay, Don, or you can go. Okay. All right, can I give you a little introduction?
Sure, I think I'm standing by the door. Most people might think I'm the heavyset guard, take care of the door, but I'm not.
Yes, Wilson Center Security. He's loaned over from the Trump Hotel, which is right next door. Which you know, it does have very good coffee. The Donald Trump Starbucks. I hate myself every time I go there, but I can't stop it. Most of you know Bob Carberry. I'm not going to read the full bio that's in the that's in your program, but Bob really is can I say godfather? The godfather of Canada-U.S. regulatory cooperation. I've known Bob for a number of years, and when he was appointed to his position heading up the Canada side on the RCC, people said, you know, he comes from an agri-food background, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, something about poachers being the best gamekeepers or vice versa. And he really did an extraordinary job in that position because he could sit down with regulators and wait for them to get to a sensible position and force them to talk sense. Worked equally well with industry. We think he left too soon, but he may disagree now that he's Bob Carberry, Carberry Insights, surfing, travel, hanging out with your son, making the big money, not to mention a global fellow at the Wilson Center and an important intellectual property member of the Ivey School. Maybe retirement's good. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to give us a history and future of Canada-U.S. regulatory cooperation.
That's actually nicer than you saying to me last week on the phone that I was probably debauching my way across Canada on my motorcycle.
It wouldn't be the first time.
So I did work in government in regulatory areas for almost 37 years. I was the Assistant Secretary for the RCC from its inception back in 2011 until last summer. I also put in a lot of time in the agri-food sector, as Laura said. I was Vice President of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. I was there through some of the tough times: mad cow disease, avian influenza, PI potato ban, forest pests, cutting down forests, those kinds of things. I've been to over 40 countries on technical market access issues. I've done international standards, represented Canada at the FAO, IPPC. I've done a lot of work within the NAFTA on committees as well too, informed Article 707 dispute resolution, as a matter of fact, under there. I wasn't just one of the Ottawa types that took on a senior job at CFIA. I actually started at the lowest possible job you could imagine in government, washing test tubes in a dairy lab in Manitoba for $12,000 a year, and worked my way up through inspectors' ranks. Inspection supervisor, actually had the abattoirs staff, the inspection staff, report to me for a number of years in Quebec. Did district programs job, operations jobs, headquarters jobs, director general, ADMs. In that sense, I think I'm a little bit of the last of a breed that people would actually dedicate themselves to organizations like that. So I just want you to know I did this stuff, I understand this stuff. Do I not just know where the skeletons are? I put most of them in the closets that they're in. I was regulators' worst nightmare because the rationales they were using why they couldn't do things were rationales that I had developed years before them. And I had come to Washington, D.C. probably 100 times through my career to argue with Americans about how we were right and they were wrong. And when they offered me the RCC, I must say, building something with them for a 6-year period was absolutely the best way anyone could end a career with the government of Canada. I'm very proud of the work we did, and I'm here. I'm not getting anything from Cargill or Maple Leaf, just so you know. I'm probably the only person in this room not getting a salary, but that's okay. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Okay, which clicker button is this? There we go. So the context, I want to walk you through why the RCC happened in the context and trade environment that it actually started. I want to talk about what we did in RCC, what I think needs to happen next to secure the RCC, and then talk about NAFTA. And I'll say this a couple of times. You don't need NAFTA to make regulatory cooperation work, but it sure would be helpful if you did a few things to lock it in place and take it to a much higher level. And talk about why some of these changes are important. This does read with some detail. Reason being, I owe Laura a paper on this, and this is my outline for the paper. So I will put it out in the next 3 or 4 weeks. It was actually helpful. Oops. There we go. So previously, a lot of the work that happened over the last 20, 25 years was on the heels of the WTO. We had rights and obligations. A lot has changed since that work started, a lot of success. And what the WTO did, though, was create this national government-to-government and country-to-country focus for trade obligations. There were a lot of sub-disciplines, many of which I worked in to a very deep degree: TBT, SPS, concept of national treatment, those kinds of things that are still enduring. There was always dispute settlement and recourse, so it kept the game honest. And it was highly successful in addressing tariffs and basic market access across a whole range of products. It really did change the trade dynamic, but we're now at a different starting point that require new things. At the same time that this was happening under the WTO, there was an evolution of trade and manufacturing. So there's a new reality for the regulatory systems that we have in place today. Number one, integrated supply chains are predominant. 40% of Canada-U.S. trade, cross-border trade, is intra-firm, the same company moving products back and forth in its supply chain. Global products are a reality. People want single formulations, single promotion, and move those products all over the world. Regulatory systems are following, but they're not keeping pace. The regulator's paradigm remains country-centric, and that was a traditional point of view that WTO taught us. And now there's an opportunity to take it to the next level of evolution. So manufacturing standardization and facilitated market access is hindered. We're requiring repetitive approvals for products. Companies are having to tweak formulations for no real reason. There's a number of situations with retesting and certification once a product has already come out of a regulatory system and been proven to be safe for consumption. And the domestic regulatory system effectiveness in achieving the outcomes is increasingly challenged. And this is part of another paper that I'll be writing about our regulatory systems that we have in North America are increasingly irrelevant to creating safe food because the companies are taking on a much bigger role than what government could ever do. And supply chains are not allowing us to get to where those products are really being manufactured. And they are absolutely non-sustainable from a financial standpoint. And what I mean by this is, in 1981, when I moved to Quebec on my motorcycle and took on a job as an agrologist for the first time, I was going into some juice plants, apple juice plants. And I got to see the juice apples coming off the trees, stored outside, put through the washing cycle, see them pressed, see them filtered, see them pasteurized, see them put into containers, and saw their post-production storage. I could do a pretty good job of seeing all of the critical control points within that particular manufacturing line. Now that same plant imports from China, imports from South Africa, reconstitutes the juice, and sends it. So the same piece of regulation and legislation that I was able to operate under, the inspectors now can do far less in terms of determining how safe that product is. That's why I'm saying it's increasing in irrelevance. It's not tracking with where the real world is going. Reg Co-op, when we kicked this off back in 2011, give credit where it's due, it was a US idea, not a Canadian idea. It was done on the shoulders of the Security and Prosperity Partnership, where we knew we wanted to do some stuff around people moving across the borders, and we thought maybe we should do something, or the US thought we should do something around the economic side. So Canada-U.S. was the initial priority. Again, there was nothing in the NAFTA that required this or forced this, and it was driven by leaders' commitment. First off was with Obama and Stephen Harper, and since then it's been recommitted to by Trudeau and Trump. It recognized the integration of the Canada-U.S. economy, that the manufacturing and supply chains and consumer markets were fundamentally integrated, and it also saw that these two independent regulatory systems on the same value chain and firms were creating unnecessary costs and requirements that impacted on industry, consumers, and government. In the first 5 years, we took it from a concept to a pilot to hundreds of initiatives, and it introduced a new partnership model and planning cycle in the spring of 2016 that both governments committed to. At its core, when people ask me what I accomplished, and what we accomplished was we created a new language, which was to talk about the economic realities of regulatory systems impacting on business. When I first went to the departments in Canada and the US, and I went to every regulatory department, FDA, EPA, Environment Canada, CFIA, every one of them, to a department, they all had the same reaction when I said I was there to talk to them about improving the economic situation. They all said, you're in the wrong place, we do health and safety, we have nothing to do with the economy. That changed, and that's the new language. We gave permission for a discussion around health and safety tables and helped them understand that that was not in conflict with health and safety. It was a consequence of health and safety actions, and the consequence could be limited should it be done in a smarter way. And not only did we create this new language and permission to talk about these things, we created a table for it to happen, which was the RCC. Somebody asked me recently, what did I do for a living last 6 years? I said I ran a dating agency. I brought the Canadian and US regulators together to the same table, and I set the table with a set menu informed by the stakeholders that said you need to talk about the following things, and by the way, you need to stay at the table until you come to agreement on something. So that's all it really was in its simplest terms. What we found over that first 5 years, misalignment costs are not due to the regulation itself, but it's the procedures and the requirements associated with them. which is a case in point for the discussion we're going to have a little further about food safety risk assessment. The same regulation, if it was put in place in Canada and the U.S., would still require everything to be done twice. Equivalence assessments to be done, approvals to be done twice, risk assessments done twice, everything's still done twice. So reg co-op is not just about the reg. The regulatory departments had a very low level of awareness of impact on industry costs, and we really had a lot of things come to light over that period of time about things that were already being traded, but with enormous extra costs being loaded into them. We also said, and we maintain this, is that one-way irritants won't fit. You need a willingness on both sides of the border to actually do something different. So this wasn't just yet another effort to get at the issues that have been bothering people for years. This was about a different level of maturity for products that were already being traded back and forth. And we also saw that the stakeholders had an absolutely critical role. They had to quantify the impacts and benefits because our government folks did not understand it, and I can't expect them to understand it. We don't understand what the cost situation is for business. We don't know how their operations work in detail. And also we needed them to help provide input on industry trends to help guide regulatory directions. We had a situation with energy efficiency on washers and dryers. The regulation we have in place for washers and dryers has been in place for a long time to protect our Canadian industry. Well, there is no Canadian industry anymore. And those are the kind of situations we were running into. We saw that there was an enormous amount of opportunity, but the regulators aren't going to buy in until they can see that they can deliver their mandate more efficiently and effectively through alignment and partnership. Otherwise, they see this as being extra work. And when we were able to break through this with some of the departments, that they would understand this was actually partnership that would be better for them, they jumped in. Others, it was still a little tougher. So, and also, the effort needs to be warranted. The benefits need to be apparent to spur action. And we need to look for them. And we need industry's help to be able to show where those economic benefits are. People ask me whether the culture would actually change with regulators. And I remember the first meeting, somebody said, "Come on, Bob, tell the truth. You know the regulators will never change." And in that meeting, it was at the American Chamber of Commerce, beautiful building. I said, no, all they need is opportunity and permission, and we're giving them that. I go a little further. Some of the other things in this deck now I think they need to help them along. But the regulators can do it. And what you need is new processes. You need new behaviors that will be generated from those processes. Then you will have a new culture. And we're still at the point of creating those new processes. Next steps, when I left last summer, was to complete the institutionalization between Canada and the U.S. and further evolve the regulatory partnerships. The job wasn't done yet. We also found where regulatory cooperation best applies. There's really two areas of regulation. One is on the production side, or the upstream, so creating the products, the manufacturing systems and standards and supply chains, and then downstream, the final products themselves. How do you get those products into markets? Where this works best is where the market access already exists. The trade irritants are gone. It's not about that. It's about saying, if we can approve a product together, it doesn't have to go through two processes. If we can expect a product and it comes out of a system once, a maple leaf plant, and it's safe for consumption across all of Canada, why do you need to reinspect it just because it hits a US border? It doesn't make sense. Where supply chains are integrated, so cross-border manufacturing, or where we're sourcing from common sources. Where the markets are integrated, so similar products are being offered and regulated by similarly mandated agencies, which is the case in Canada and the US. And from domestic or foreign sources, doesn't matter. It both counts. Where consumers have similar preferences and where regulators have similar approaches and risk tolerance, which is the case between Canada and the US. Even though we had hundreds of initiatives, we really saw four categories of work. If we had built bridges with our US counterparts and US with their Canadian counterparts years ago, none of the misalignments would have occurred. None of the unnecessary costs would have occurred. The first one is in common standards and tests, and you'll see risk assessment falls in all these areas. Give you an example. Automobiles, Canada, the US, there's actually a different kind of an airbag passenger protection system in Canadian and US vehicles. That's because the US does their risk assessment based on 45% seatbelt use. Canada, being Canadians, we have 95% seatbelt use. So they said that we couldn't come up with the same kind of standard, or it led to two different standards being created in place, which adds to cost, obviously, because those vehicles are being made in one market or the other for the other one as well, too. If we had a regulator sit down and doing the risk assessment say, we actually have seatbelt use that ranges from 45 to 95, you'd end up in the same place. Product approvals and reviews. Single point application process for both countries. Synchronize when you're going to be doing these approvals. Do a joint risk assessment and get a single approval for both countries. Car seats for babies. Canada and the U.S. have car seat requirements for babies. Only the U.S. kind of does theirs in odd years. Canada does theirs in even years. So you end up in a situation where the big retailers, such as the Costco's and others, can't ever bring in the same car seat from the same plants that are building them in Asia. So you end up with this asynchronous situation. The truth is we love our babies the same in both countries. All we need to do is to get the regulators to work together to do it on the same schedule. You end up with one seat, you end up with more economies of scale, you end up with cheaper prices for consumers, and the regulators only have to put in half the effort because they can share in the workload. Lipsticks is one of my favorite examples. Most of the people in this room probably use some sort of lip balm or lipsticks. I know Rory does. And we found in the US, there was an interesting split screen presentation done at a conference I went to where they had a US company and a Canadian company stand up and say, if you want to put this lipstick product into the Canadian market, here's the 3 pieces of paper you have to fill out and it costs about $400. Fellow from the US firm stood up and said, and if you want to put that same product into the US market, it's 3 pieces of paper, about $400. Now, the same product, don't change the formulation. Nothing's different. In the US, you want to put an SPF 15 claim on it. In the US, 3 pieces of paper, $400. In Canada, 3 binders of information, $400,000 approval, because it's now categorized as a drug. Didn't stop market access, but it sure as hell had an effect on the bottom line of the company and what consumers are paying for that product. And we found all kinds of these situations because we categorized the product differently. They're in the process of resolving it, but it's those kinds of things that we found out. Whoops, whoops, there we go. My thumbs are too big. Not good for a guitar player, right? So managing third-party import risk. What we're looking for is moving things to the perimeter. There is an interesting situation recently that was being debated, and I know the American Chamber of Commerce was quite heated about it, where we have an issue with forest pests having been introduced into the North American environment through wood packing material from Asia. That's known. I was the one who had to cut down Point Pleasant Park in Halifax because it was right near the shipyards and we had something called the brown spruce longhorn beetle come in. We also had the Asian longhorn beetle that came up from New York. We have the emerald ash borer that most people probably know about that wiped out all of southern Ontario and all of Michigan for the ash trees. So we've got all of these forest pests. And because of the way the rules are written, each country has to put its own measures in place. So the US is proposing a rule to change the type of packing material that pallets are made out of. So you can imagine how many shipments every day to protect from a forest pest. But you got to think about what the risk mitigating factor is, because once these pests are into our contiguous forests, stopping them at a border point on a piece of packing material hasn't got much to do with it. You probably hit 1,000 of them with your windshield on your drive up. So we need to rethink the model we're using in North America, given how closely related we are by this artificial political border with respect to plant health, animal health, and I would argue in food safety in a highly integrated industry. And then leveraging the outcomes achieved in the other jurisdiction. I already talked about Maple Leaf trying to send meat, but think about frozen fish stick company operating out of Nova Scotia. They can go through their fisheries inspection through the CFIA. They can then load up their trucks and drive them 4,000 miles, get them to other markets, get them to Vancouver. But if they hit the border to the US, it's subject to an entirely different inspection regime and reinspection. It doesn't make sense. The border is triggering too many things. So next steps to secure success for regulatory cooperation. I won't go into all the detail here, but build on the first generation US executive order. They actually created a special category for regulatory cooperation work plans, and it allows them to be subjected to a special consideration. Canada hasn't changed its policy yet. But what we need to do is start to look at combined data for risk assessments, so that when you look at an option and it's actually aligned, take into account both Canada and US data, so you can actually see what the overall benefit is. Look for confidential dialogue between the regulators and with OIRA and our folks at TBS-RAS, Regulatory Affairs Secretariat. Because when it comes to the 11th hour and the final tweaks are being done to the rules, you need to have an open dialogue. That's now prohibited, so we need to allow for that. We now, wouldn't it be nice if we could do simultaneous consultation for both markets at the same time? So a rule on crude rail tankers, which we just did, crude oil rail tankers. Why didn't we just put it out to Canada-U.S. at the same time, take all the comments together, and come up with one resolution for both? So those kinds of things. Require departmental development of internal regulatory cooperation strategies. One of the things that struck me was, that's not Jeff running, he actually has to take a call at 2, he told me in advance. It's nothing I said or did. So much for him sneaking out, eh? Required departmental development of internal regulatory cooperation strategies. What this one means is, I had a colleague that worked for automobile safety standards, Lorene Kinney at Transport Canada. And we would come along and say, okay, you have to align some more standards with the US. And then our trade people would knock on the door and say, oh, by the way, and we need you to align some of those standards with Europe. And then somebody else would come in and say, oh yeah, and we're negotiating with Korea, they also want to have some aligned with them too. And oh yeah, don't forget Japan. Japan wants those same standards aligned to their standards. So poor Lorene is laying in the fetal position, shivering in her corner of her office, waiting for somebody to rationalize this. And what you really need is a strategy that says, who, on what, when, and with whom are you going to align? You need to start to work through it. So that's an internal strategy, but then regulatory plans and things can be synced up. We need to enhance the governance. The council we had didn't work all that well. The work was done by the Secretariat, but there's some things we can do to fix it, to ramp it up. I think you'd still need some senior and political and binational oversight. NAFTA is a perfect place to plug some of that in. We need to really commit to that annual planning cycle. I think it's been off to a little bit of a slow start. We need to formalize the role of stakeholders in short, medium, and long-term planning, and we can embed that in NAFTA about a role for stakeholders. We also need, I think, formal procedures for stakeholders to identify regulatory cooperation issues throughout the year to the departments, to the Secretariat and Council, to the oversight body. When the U.S. was still negotiating with Europe on a trade agreement, the U.S. Chamber put something forward that was quite interesting about a petition process. I don't think we have to go that far, but I think we have to give standing to good ideas. It can't just be up to the regulatory department to say, no, I don't want to do that. It has to be a little bit more analysis involved and a little bit more weight after the industry comes with something from both sides of the border and says, this looks like a good idea, this would work. And then further, the regulatory department ambition and leadership. Not much we can do in the NAFTA there, but it still needs to happen. So NAFTA, all I do here is outline a little bit more in terms of the detail. But what is the NAFTA agreement itself? It is really permission, opportunity, a statement of aspiration about what a new regulatory relationship might look like, and it's about setting an expectation that things are going to be done differently. I don't see much of that in the discussions yet. Hopefully it'll go there, but I really think it's important to have a chapter that talks about Reg Co-op and talks about it as a new stage of evolution for the relationships between the two countries on the regulatory side. Some of these other things are just what I repeated in the earlier slides. I won't go through that in a lot of great detail, but it just talks in detail about those areas where I think the NAFTA agreement could benefit. And then I want to talk about TBT SPS for just a moment, because I think this can be a game changer. I already talked about the fact that the NAFTA region is a contiguous territory in so many ways, from integrated manufacturing to common consumer preferences to the physical aspects of it, where our forests cross the border a lot more than our roads do, where animal diseases don't care about, even influenza, it's from birds that fly over top. You can't stop them at borders. We need to recognize this. Particularly the northern U.S. and Canada are very, very similar. So there's an opportunity here that a lot of other countries don't have. And I think there's an opportunity to move beyond duplicative country-to-country measures, especially where we have these common consumer markets and common preferences exist, and where the manufacturing and supply chains are integrated. So I think we can focus on addressing risk to consumers once through the same measures. There's been a lot of talk about equivalence. I haven't seen it work a lot. We'll get granted equivalence, and then the equivalence verification measures snap back to what the original measures were in the first place. So we actually need to move to having the same system in both countries, build it together, and deliver it together, and all this stuff will go away. And we need to focus on supply chain risk, not the fact that it crosses a border. In these situations, there is an opportunity to address plant, animal, and food risk jointly. And there are some things that we can put into the TBT SPS chapter that would signal that we can do this and move away from the strict border-to-border kind of requirements we put in place. Further, I think that what we can do can be international standards, they can be regionally developed, or they can be commonly adopted from third parties. And of course, the implementation procedures need to be overseen. In the food industry, I talk very often about the very good job that Maple Leaf Foods has done by implementing the Global Food Safety Initiative, and it provides some specific advantages beyond what the Government of Canada can do. And I'll hearken you back to my juice example. The same thing exists for Maple Leaf and for Cargill and for consumer products and all sorts of other things. What they've done is adopted some Global Food Safety Initiative that requires a standards that's adhered to by their suppliers, suppliers, right down to individual firms in the other countries. So you don't need to rely on a national regulatory system that's in place in the other country. You can rely on this, that's supply chain specific. It's actually going to give you a higher level of safety than any nationally legislated system can give you because the reach is better, quite simply, and it's verified by third parties. So there's an opportunity there. So I would be pressing for some inclusions that talk about, recognize that specific opportunities exist as afforded by our contiguous territory and all those other things. I think we can promote the use of jointly developed common requirements and programs that implemented once serve to satisfy health, safety, SPS, TB2 requirements for both countries or for all countries, whoever's involved in it, and recognize the third-party specialized systems and accredited third-party conformity assessment bodies can be an alternative to the traditionally developed and delivered programs, recognized by food safety acts, but they can actually replace some of the excruciatingly expensive presence we have in some of our facilities. It's very expensive. Why are these changes important? Well, don't forget the context. The trend towards global manufacturing, supply chains, and global products is continuing. The country-centric regulatory system's reach is limited. At the same time, the need for a reach is increasing. Specialized knowledge requirements are increasing. I went to a seminar recently on supply chains. The most modern companies have people dedicated to overseeing their supply chains. They know everything about their suppliers. Every nook and cranny, every requirement is being monitored at every point in time. It's a new industry out there. Reliance on most countries to implement credible national regulatory systems is unrealistic and frankly unnecessary, particularly if they're countries who haven't been doing it for 20 or 30 years. Applying requirements in the Canada-U.S. context with two highly evolved regulatory systems is a habit and an unnecessary use of resources, and I think we need to start to shift the paradigm. Our regulatory systems are decreasing in their ability to help achieve health and safety mandates in this global environment, and the country-to-country approach is less relevant than it's ever been. So what can NAFTA do? It can help us on three fronts. It can set a stage for evolution, outline the aspirations and the nature of a new type of regulatory partnership, get some pilot projects going, like the one that you're going to hear about a little bit later this afternoon, shift the dialogue from what we're trying to do to each other to what we can do together for mutual benefit. This part of the press coverage of the NAFTA is absolutely killing me. It's hard to watch because there's so much we need to do together to take on the increasingly complex and difficult regulatory and trade environment outside of our collective borders. Efficiency, provide for new mechanisms to move away from the duplicative routine activities. Risk assessment, I think, is a wonderful place to start. Our scientists went to the same schools, were taught the same stuff, and they have the same DNA. And provide for shared oversight of the supply chains, supply chain participants in other countries. We can do that together. And finally, on the effectiveness, start using some other systems and experts to help achieve our mandates. So I see the NAFTA as an opportunity to help set the stage for some of this new thinking. I think on the regulatory cooperation side, doing changes in NAFTA would be extremely helpful. We don't absolutely need them, And the initiative you're going to hear about in a minute doesn't absolutely need it, but wouldn't it be nice if we set it up as the first potential win under the NAFTA agreement? So that's all I have. Thank you.
Have a chair. Let's have a chat. Well, we got a few minutes. I'll take one of these. So that's lots to think about, and a really comprehensive presentation, and really one of the best I've ever seen, but I knew it would be before you started. What I wonder about, though, is the establishment of the RCC was kind of a unique moment in time. The Americans were looking for some announceable for an upcoming summit, and they didn't want to do the hard stuff necessarily, so regulatory alignment seemed like it should be easy. The Europeans were pressing them for regulatory alignment on the TTIP front. At that time, Prime Minister Harper and President Obama were relatively like-minded. There was surprising pockets of support for this out of National Security Council and also out of what's now Global Affairs Canada, and it happened. And there was a lot of goodwill and effort and energy to make it happen. Now you're talking about institutionalizing this happy accident. What's it going to take to do that?
Don't forget, some of us were married because of happy accidents.
How old's your happy accident now?
I meant meeting somebody in a bar. You're going too far. We've already institutionalized a new concept, and this was one of the more rewarding things in the fourth and fifth year of the RCC, where people would come in and say, such and such department is doing something, and that doesn't align to the principles of regulatory cooperation. That was a win. And we've also installed secretariats in both countries that are ready to have a dialogue. All I'm trying to do here is say, talk about this. This is the next stage that you need to take it to, okay? It was always on a ramp up, and it didn't finish getting up that ramp. And there's an opportunity to use the NAFTA to embed some of these things. At the very least, to have a discussion so that even if NAFTA doesn't happen the way we think, all these things can happen anyways. As I said, you don't need NAFTA to do these things. The external environment that we're in, the trade environment, and the natural relationship we have, particularly between Canada and the U.S., in my mind, after being close to this, is a no-brainer. And I said to somebody in a closed forum, so now I'm not with government anymore, I can say it openly. When you look at what we've done to ourselves since NAFTA 1, our reaction as regulators should be shame on us. Shame on us. We did something that was supposed to be building a relationship, and we've just kept erecting these things independently and created these barriers. I'll use the example you probably heard, Laura, of I waited too long to buy my ticket son to go to Florida for spring break a couple years ago, so I started surfing southern places and ended up taking him to see the Alamo in San Antonio. And I was in the middle of this exercise, and it struck me when I'm down there, I have no fear about my son breathing the air, drinking the water, eating the food, taking over-the-counter drugs. We can go and buy and rent a vehicle. I know it's going to be safe. And I know my U.S. colleagues, when they come up to Canada, they feel the same way. But our regulatory systems don't recognize it. Something is fundamentally wrong. I guess we didn't anticipate there was going to be a competent, willing partner on the other side of the border, but guess what? There is. So I think we should go, shame on us. Let's start to fix it, and let's start doing nothing new. Let's never modernize a thing on our own. Meat inspection system, start now. In 5 years, you have a new meat inspection system, and it can be identical in both countries, and all this border nonsense stops. So it's time to get on with it. It's not about leaders' commitment. We've already got the place for the new dialogue. That's already been socialized. We've got a place for it to happen. Let's set the table with some bigger ideas.
Great. Now, you mentioned NAFTA being a source of momentum, that you don't embed this stuff necessarily in the agreement. And I know we're going to be talking about NAFTA shortly, so I don't want to take any wind out of those sails, but NAFTA is a trilateral agreement. So how does your bilateral framework fit within that trilateral agreement?
I actually have an answer for that, and it'll be in the paper that I owe you.
Excellent. I look forward to
it goes like this. We need to move away from the country-to-country context. And if a company is going to be working with, whether it be pharmaceuticals, where the components and the compounds are being developed in India, or whether it's the apple juice company I talked about before that's sourcing out of South Africa and China, or whether it's some other kind of business, we need to look more at the specific supply chain and come up with a specific solution that will address that supply chain. So you don't need the national system to system. So in Canada and the U.S., because of the integrated economies, target-rich environment. And I would argue that if Canada and the U.S. align on automobile standards, and Mexico is building components for that, that they already benefit if Canada and the U.S. get it together. But there are specific things within Mexico that, yeah, we should be looking at potentially aligning there and putting in some of these systems that track with that supply chain. Do we need Mexico to put in the same kind of regulatory system for automobiles domestically just so they can play with us? Absolutely not, and they don't want to. They want to hit cheaper price points. They don't look at airbags as being as necessary as us or ABS braking system. The price point's more important to them. So it isn't just about creating national systems anymore. We have to be more specific and targeted and go down the supply chain and go after specific products.
Right.
That makes more sense.
And I think where you made that distinction between upstream and downstream operations, I think that's really key to that. A last question, then I'm going to open it up to you folks. You mentioned incentives for regulators. You've clearly been successful in building incentives for regulators who are focused on health and safety primarily. That's their mandate. Trade never showed up in their mandate. Now all of a sudden they've got to take the economy seriously. How do you build those incentives?
I think a lot, what I'm suggesting in here is that you start to build it in policy. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't just depend on altruism. And I know there was a discussion at very senior levels at one point about not passing any regulations unless they were fully aligned. That's an interesting place to start, you know, and not allowing for programming to be adjusted unless there's a discussion with the other country first to determine whether, but that will then require that those strategies I talked about on who you're going to align with and on what, I think those would be necessary. But I think policy is a big part of it. When the U.S. put in their executive order, anything that was in a regulatory cooperation work plan, if they got a regulatory proposal and they said, is this aligned with Canada because it's on the work plan? And they said, well, not quite, go back to the drawing board. It gave an extra impetus to things that should be aligned, as informed by stakeholders, as accepted by regulators. It gave them a little bit more policy strength. So I would be recommending the same thing in the Canadian policy and the U.S. one, whenever it's renewed, to get even stronger on that front as well, too. So at this point, I think a big part of it is you need to put the policy and the oversight in place to make sure the right things happen.
Right. Who's got my microphones? Ben and Emil. Questions from the audience or comments designed as questions, ending in a question mark. Brett. And please identify yourself, Brett, even though everybody in the room knows who you are.
Hi, Brett Fortin with Inside U.S. Trade. There are many critics of regulatory cooperation, and having covered TTIP extensively, their arguments are well known. It's, you know, they're going to call it a race to the bottom. How do you combat that argument, and especially given the current political climate where the U.S. has been rather inward-looking? How do you convince an administration that's focused on America first that the border is less important?
Well, we faced those same issues as we were about to launch. We were aware that they could come forward. So we put some rules in place about how we were going to tackle this. Number one, at no point will we simply adopt the other one's standard. What we'll do is look for junctures where one country is about to improve its standard and load into that exercise. So at all points, we were actually improving the standard rather than the other. If there was areas where there's going to be wholesale adoption, we just kind of ignored those. But we got past all of those. The sovereign decision making is another big one. And even under the risk assessment model, what we're saying is all the work leading up to decision should be done together, but the final decision, you still have absolutely every right not to go in that direction. But our belief is, if you actually put the same science and same data through the same kind of a grinder with the same kind of skill sets, you will likely end up in a situation where you make the same kind of determination. But we would keep those independent. Canada right now has a rule where you have to have daytime running lights on your vehicle. U.S., you don't have to have that. Risk assessments have been done. Canada just chooses to have it. That's okay. All we were ever hoping was that at least the discussion happened first. But we were able to avoid all these things in the way we structured the regulatory cooperation exercise at the outset. So I don't think there's any critics of the Canadian-U.S. exercise that can legitimately say any of those things about race to the bottom, loss of sovereignty, all those kinds of things. Because in its design, we made sure that that wouldn't happen.
Other questions?
Hey, Bob, Bill West with the Mead
Bill.
Institute. As you know, we've been working very hard on this with you and the other two governments in terms of RCC, 21st Century Border Initiative with Mexico. And we've had a NAFTA regulatory cooperation working group in the meat and poultry industry. And we've had the proposals out there. And frankly, not all regulators agree with this. And I think that's one of the stumbling blocks here is that certainly we agree with everything you've said today, and we've committed to this and agree that we don't need it in a trade agreement to move forward. But if you get resistance from the regulators, not all of them are on board.
Yep.
What do we do?
Well, I did have a line about this, and I think this goes to part of your question as well, Brett. The regulators aren't going to move unless they see that they can deliver their mandate in a more effective and efficient way. So we need to be careful to make sure that when we put proposals in front, that it makes good sense to them. But they need to understand it in a collective way, right? So otherwise it just looks like extra work for some other purposes. But in the circumstances where we saw some really good work move in the past, such as the automobile transport and those kinds of things, it's because the regulators recognized, well, I don't need to do everything twice here. I can actually partner with these folks and we can do veterinary drugs, those kinds of things. Let's do some of the approval work together. Not all of it, but some of it. Break it out a little bit. So I think we have to be very careful at this next stage, is to cast things as, this is a win for you, regulator. Why would you choose a path to developing a higher level of safety that costs you more than what it otherwise would if you were partnering with someone else?
That's the problem. Some of them want to do it twice.
Well, and I don't have a solution for that. Outside, if you think I'm big, you should see my brother.
I'm going to take the last question. You mentioned quickly the White House executive order, and we who have been watching RCC note that it was a very important step that the U.S. took to provide more leverage, more consideration for regulatory alignment in trade agreements and other commitments the U.S. might make. Why the heck has Canada not put in place something similar? And does the U.S. executive order, does it have longevity into the new administration?
Yeah, executive orders aren't removed. And in fact, since then, and I know Jeff Weiss is going to talk about this, he knows this a lot better, there's been 2 additional executive orders talking about regulatory efficiency and those kinds of things that all play well into the regulatory cooperation thing. Because Reg Co-op is about doing it more efficiently, there's no question. So it all plays in. So there's more and more executive orders, but you need to specifically remove an executive order. There's been no interest in doing that. In fact, Trump's administration has supported the regulatory cooperation. So, you know, people ask me, you know, how do you stop this thing? I don't think you can. I mean, the stakeholders see there's some real benefit. When regulators look at it with any degree of rigor and open eyes, they see there's a real opportunity for them. And so I think it just makes good sense. We just need to lock it in.
What about Canada? Has there been moves?
Canada is just in the process now of renewing their policy. They had it out for comment. I missed it, unfortunately, so
You were out debauching.
I was out there. Actually, I might have been. But hopefully this will help influence some of that process as well. Once I get into a paper, I'll get it to them, Laura.
Great, thank you. Well, you're going to have another kick at Bob in the last panel, so if there's any questions that you think of later, you'll have him again. So join me in thanking Bob for that excellent presentation.